Hello, hello. My name is Umar Bakis and I'm the convener of UDDC 2020. My name is Umar Bakis from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. We're about to go live with our open semi-final for room number 1. As it stands, the motion reads, "This House regrets NATO's enhanced presence in Eastern Europe." The debate should start shortly. I wish all the teams best of luck. And we now will just wait for the debate to commence.
Welcome everyone to the semi-finals and good luck in this round. So without further ado, I would like to call the Prime Minister to open the case and decide of the government. I just need to get my timer on and then I'll be ready to start. Panel, the West's hegemony on violence has been something that continues to grow over time. History has shown their ability to access particular aspects of international relations through forceful means in ensuring that they maintain that very hegemony. It is these very problems that exist as a result of this that place the West in a position where they now become the sort of military police of the world, even in spaces where there isn't necessarily reason for them to exist within. We think that the exacerbation of tensions within specific regions as a result of Western interference is something that continuously places these regions in very precarious positions where they are likely to have to deal with the end result of all these issues. We think that in this instance, this is something that we cannot allow to continue any further, but more so than anything else, we think that in this instance, it is something that is specifically regrettable because it places these types of regions in a position where they specifically have to deal with the kind of issues that result from this type of response, right? The first thing that we want to tell you from opening government is that firstly, we think that there's an increased tension, sort of like exacerbation of tensions at the point where NATO is involved in the Eastern Europe region. But secondly, we think that there's an entrenchment of the Western hegemony in terms of the way in which it interacts with the rest of states. And this is something that is particularly regrettable. A couple of things, issues of context here. The first thing that we tell you is that we think that this move to sort of expand NATO's interest in the space is something that happens as a result of trying to sort of bolster security and deterrence in like the Eastern Europe region, specifically after Russia's intervention in the Ukraine. We think in this instance, NATO continues to look for very specific ways of boosting their military readiness, and we think that this is something that poses a very particular threat in this instance. We think that the ability of particular countries within this area specifically to respond is something that is particularly regrettable, especially at the point where we see them continuing to grow their own military presence within this space to ensure that they're able to protect themselves. Why do we think this is specifically problematic? The first thing that we tell you here is that there are already incredible amounts of like sort of instances where the existing tensions between Russia and America have created particular problems within the international relations space. We think here there's something specifically important when it comes to this. We think that firstly, it places them in a position where there's constant back and forth between the two that places other countries in a position where they have to pick a side. We think the polarization of this particular region is something that we don't value, especially at the point where it places this particular region in a position where one or the other has to pick sides. We think that the ability to move beyond the kind of tensions that exist there or deal with those tensions is not something that needs specific response from NATO specifically, and more so than anything else, we think it doesn't necessarily need the kind of military policing and movement in this space. We think that military interference here is something that is specifically likely to move those kind of tensions and further them, and this is not something that we value. Opening opposition, go. Andrew?
So what is the primary reason that incited the enhancement of NATO's presence within the region? That's the debate you're supposed to have.
Not necessarily. So what I'm going to tell you about this specifically is that we think that even at the point where they assume that there's very specific reasons where they need to interact here, we think that that in and of itself is still not justification enough. Because firstly, we tell you here that NATO specifically is not part of that particular region. And even at the point where there are particular countries that interact in that way, we think that the existence of the tensions between Russia and America are ones that are likely to place those very countries who might opt into that type of situation in a position where they face greater danger. Because we think that the ability of these countries to interact with each other militarily is something that ought to, in this instance, be completely avoided, especially at the point where it's likely to cause a very specific kind of tension within these spaces. But secondly, what we want to talk about here is this idea of like the kind of guise of protection that exists often when these types of states want to intervene within spaces. We think this is something that's specifically important because the kind of trajectory of history of the West when it comes to military intervention is something that is specifically important because contextually they do a lot of these types of sort of interventions where they entrench very specific ideals within these spots and then remain there for a longer time than what is necessary. We think this is specifically problematic and often warrants response in the international community. We don't value the kind of response that you're likely to get from like the Russians, but more so than anything else, we think that we don't like the idea, we don't value the idea of like this weird Cold War situation that is great. But the second thing that we tell you here is that there are even greater harms at the point where we look at the region in and of itself. We think that the closeness of countries like China that are likely to have specific types of reactions in this instance is something that poses an even greater harm at the point where we allow the greater military presence of NATO here. Why do we think that military presence specifically, especially when it comes to the Western military alliance, is something that presents a particular danger? The first thing that we tell you here is that the direct and existing tensions there place them in a position where they're unlikely to get any sort of resolution for the issues that exist within that space. Secondly, we tell you that the ability to get to those resolutions is not something that is likely to happen at the point where there's a greater threat to the countries that exist within that very region that don't necessarily buy into the ideals that come from the West. The third thing that we tell you here is that there's often this guise of like sort of protection that comes from the West at the point where they interact with other countries' issues and more so in terms of international relations. We think that the constant sort of maintenance of a Western violent hegemony over international relations is something that continues to grow, and we think that at the point where it is allowed to continue to grow, we face very particular and very regrettable harms that result from the kind of like responses that come from states that maintain and hold the same amount of power that exists in this instance. And we think that Russia specifically is an incredible threat at the point where we interact with it in this way. The fourth thing that we tell you here is that the interference of these types of countries, specifically the United States, when it comes to these types of issues is something that often works on the basis of their own interests outside of necessarily looking for the kind of like resolutions that ought to come from these sort of interventions in the first place, and we don't think we ought to allow them to be able to access the ability to do these types of things, especially at the point where we've seen over time that they don't necessarily enter these spaces seeking to get to this, and often there's this guise of protection that never actually interacts with them or allows these individuals to be able to access that greater sort of solvency. We don't think that we're going to be able to get that sort of solvency at the point where we deal with it in terms of like a military alliance specifically. But thirdly, we tell you here there's a specific discussion to be had about like the kind of issues that exist internally within NATO and why those will continue to then sort of like destabilize the existing alliance within these countries themselves. And this is something that is specifically problematic, that is not necessarily going to allow for the better sort of functionality of that very intervention in the first place. This is why we think specifically in this instance there's a greater regrettability because the harms are far greater than what we then get at the point where we don't have this type of intervention.
Thank you for your speech. And I would like to call the opposition to open the case on their side.
Sorry, I'm just doing an audio check. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to start. Panel, I think that the opening government largely mischaracterizes today's debate, because I think that the arguments that they're trying to run happens in a world in which these countries do not welcome increased military presence of NATO, but secondly, one in which these countries themselves, that being Eastern European countries, are not part of the NATO alliance. Because please recognize, panel, that this isn't just America coming and creating a military intervention within Eastern European countries, telling them how to dictate their democracies. These are countries which have already meaningfully consented into the NATO alliance on two levels. Firstly, on a military allyship, but secondly, on a political allyship. So all the arguments about how these countries are essentially being used as a proxy role for America, all these countries might not agree with the politics of America and shouldn't be bullied into believing in a Western hegemony, don't stand. Because this isn't America disproportionately exerting itself. It is an allyship that is welcome. It looks like, for example, that they're welcoming military involvement on their border as means of help, not as a means of the West just overly exerting themselves. You can't just run arguments on a very basic understanding of generic harms of militarization without understanding the intricacies of NATO. Three things we're going to. Firstly, we're going to show you why this is efficacy. Secondly, I'm going to show you why there's enough internal checks and balances. But lastly, I'm going to show you why there's a general principle of allowing Eastern European countries to maintain some kind of protection. So firstly, let's just talk about efficacy, right? Because the main argument on the Prime Minister's side is saying that there's significantly no efficacy that is proven. If anything, they say that there's significant harms because what you do is you exacerbate tensions. This is completely untrue, because the reason why NATO was created in and of itself was to protect states against Russia, which at the time during the Cold War was increasing expansionization, particularly on democratized states, right? Which means that there is already an existing threat to democracy, a threat to something like sovereignty, which is something that they value on their side. We think that there is already an existing threat. You cannot just argue in a vacuum and say that this harms sovereignty, this increases Western expansionism, because on the contrary, we think that's actually protection against Russian expansionism, because they have proven to want to do this during the Cold War. But then after Ukraine, there's also significant evidence to show that Russia is still increasing its expansionist efforts within Eastern Europe. And this is why the increased presence of NATO exists there currently. The reason this is important is because there is a significant efficacy that exists when NATO is able to protect Eastern European countries from Russian expansionism by allowing it to have a stronger military protection. This is significantly important because Russia is an actor that exerts expansionism on the basis of its strong military, number one, but secondly, that is shown to evade other aspects of accountability, such as the UN, because over there they have veto, and so they're able to avoid accountability, or in international laws in general, they're able to avoid things like transparency. And so we see that the existence of NATO is one that provides efficacy, but secondly, one that provides an exclusive kind of efficacy that you can't just argue on the basis of some kind of an alternative like negotiations or anything else that they're going to bring on that side, right? But beyond that, we don't necessarily think that we also think that they've been successful in doing this. Russia has stopped its expansionism efforts within Eastern Europe specifically because of the presence of NATO. But beyond that, we also think that if NATO were to reduce its presence, we would see a significant rise in Russian expansionism, because largely when a specific actor is the one that holds another actor accountable, when that actor retracts, we think that you create a rise in an emboldenment of the enemy to rise up. No, thank you. An example of this is when Trump pulled out troops from Syria, there was a rise in attack from the Kurds, because the reason why those troops were there was to serve a specific enemy, to protect a specific actor. When they got pulled out, it emboldens the actor to retaliate, because they no longer feel that they're being held accountable in the same ways that they previously were. But beyond that, there's also other actors, right? So we also think that there's other actors, such as China, such as North Korea, or such as global terrorism that could be threats to Eastern European countries and are potential threats to Eastern European countries. The nuance here is to say that even in the absence of Russia as an actor, we think that states are legitimate in using militarization to protect themselves, because the nature of threats is that they're often very unpredictable. And because they're very unpredictable, it means that you need to be prepared to fight off threats with militarization. But then let's talk about why NATO is a good mechanism, right? Because we don't necessarily buy the argument that NATO, I'll take you in a moment, we don't necessarily buy the argument that NATO is just a harmful actor. Actually, I'll take closing government.
Okay, why can't the Eastern European countries prevent this by having, I don't know, an allyship with NATO? Why does NATO specifically need to be there? Russia would fear retaliation.
Okay, fantastic. So the reason why NATO actually has to be they actually have to be a part of NATO is because they serve significant benefits when they are part of NATO as opposed to just having an alliance with NATO. Please recognize the concession in this POI, which already proves that there is some need to have NATO's involvement within Eastern Europe in order for protection. This is why we think they are the best actors to be part of NATO. What happens when you're part of NATO? Number one, when you're a part of NATO, you then get the capacity to actually make decisions within NATO in and of itself. So NATO doesn't exist in the same world that the Prime Minister wants to argue, one of just like America dominating everything. There are significant checks and balances that exist within NATO. There are almost 30 countries that are part of NATO, and we think that they're able to negotiate and come up with common deals that benefit everyone. We think in that instance it's significantly better that Eastern European countries have a place at the negotiation table so that they are also able to set their own terms at a point where they bring NATO into their borders. A significant benefit you get, which is often the benefit that countries that get like invaded don't have. But beyond that, we also think that there's significant checks and balances that exist within NATO in and of itself, right? We think that a big part of the creation of NATO is not just one of military allyship, but beyond that, of political allyship, one of peace. This means that countries that function within NATO have a significant benefit because it means that they are protected from the military power of those that are also in NATO. So, for example, being part of NATO as an Eastern European country gives you significant benefit because it means that America can't just invade you and they can't just decide that they're going to disrespect your military. It means that you are also protected because that military also then gives allyship to you, and that military is also there to serve your interests and protect your interests. But beyond all of this panel, we think we need to talk about specifically Eastern European states. Is there an existing threat within Eastern Europe? Yes, in terms of Russia. But beyond that, I've given you significant reasons to believe that there can be unprecedented threats in the form of global terrorism, in the form of China, in forms of rogue states like North Korea. But beyond that panel, we think that the reason why NATO is so important is because it isn't just an actor that is going to be rogue. It is an actor that is there to prevent any kind of exasperation of expansionism. But also NATO can also be used to do good things, right? During the COVID-19 crisis, militaries have actually been deployed to help with things like service provision, and they're not just rogue actors as the proposition would lead us to believe. We think that these are actors that can be used to help these countries. We think that they get a better seat of
Your time's up.
Very proud to oppose.
Thank you for your speech. And I would like to call Deputy Prime Minister to fill in here.
Is this audible?
You're breaking up a little bit. For now, audible enough.
Okay, let me try to. PC is worse, so let's hope this holds out for their. To the other teams, I'll be taking POIs roughly close to 5 minutes. So, in case I don't see a POI on the chat, please just interject on the voice. I think that should be fine. If that's fine, if that. Okay. I'll be sure. Okay, I'll be beginning in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what does peace like? We think that peace means peace, or peace means countries being able to live peaceably with each other, regardless of what the West's opinion is on that peace. We think that the presence, or the rather enhanced presence of NATO within Eastern European countries tends to distort what peace looks like, and it means that peace ought to be built on the terms that NATO wants, on the terms that the West wants. And I think that that's something that's abhorrent, and that's something that Nolutando has argued about in terms of how the enhanced presence of NATO, also in addition to sort of like offering protection that Anam wants to argue, destabilizes the sovereignty of the countries within Eastern Europe. I'll be arguing this at length, right? But first of all, let's start with the independent rebut before the rest will be integrated. One of the important things that we get from Anam's speech is the fact that, well, enhanced NATO presence is going to help against Russian expansion. We don't think that is true. The reason why this isn't true is because ever since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, nothing has been done, even with serious or heavy NATO presence within the region. Nothing has been done to either recover that region. We think that that of itself proves how sometimes futile NATO's actions can be, especially when they're faced with another power such as Russia. But I'll be expanding on this later in my speech. But before that, let's get into some like constructive as I extend from what Nolutando has been given. We think that we have to talk about why NATO's presence polarizes the region. And panel note that this is quite important because at the end of the day, what this debate seeks to achieve is peace that is the longevity of peace within the region. And we think that an enhanced NATO's presence sort of like destabilizes that, right? We think that enhanced military presence, in essence, it is like a peace in context between the United States and Russia primarily. And I'm tells you that NATO isn't the United States of America. There's a lot of this other like checks and balances in many countries that exist within NATO. We think that that is the face value of NATO. We think that in of itself, in essence, those checks and balances are things that are constantly being broken in expeditions that the United States has carried out in the name of NATO, whereas those expeditions, for example, the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, used to serve primarily American interests before British and French interests, right? We don't think that is necessarily true, but I'll be talking about that also further on within my speech. So we think that what does this polarization look like? We think the enhanced military presence of NATO within Russia effectively tells all the Eastern countries within like all the Eastern European countries to either side, firstly, either with Russia or with NATO. What that means is it already draws a line between beliefs, it already draws a lines between policies and strategies. We think that this polarization is something that is harmful, and it's something that is an obstacle to peace building. Because we think that peace isn't peace just because it's on terms of the West, but we think that building peace by including the West in of itself or NATO is something that is like kind of like hard to achieve, as I'll be explaining just now. How is peace harder to achieve? Peace becomes hard to achieve because then these Eastern European countries that have enhanced NATO military presence within them cannot opt out easily of the agreements sort of that they have with NATO for NATO's protection or NATO's supposed protection. What this means is, at a point at which Ukraine decides it wants to make peace with Russia on Ukraine's terms, this becomes difficult because NATO or the United States of America and its allies are diametrically opposed to Russia. What this means, therefore, is that Ukraine cannot on its own establish peace or establish terms of treaties of peace with Russia in terms of policies or economic ties because it's being backed by NATO. NATO, by virtue of an enhanced military presence, this will then ought to be given a seat at the table. The seat at the table of NATO means that instead of considering only Ukrainian-Russian interests, you now ought to consider Ukrainian-Russian interests and an addition of like American or NATO interests, which is something that we think is going to be quite difficult. The problem with this panel is that even if at this point in time, some Eastern European countries are not living peaceably with Russia, and we think that there are policy differences, the point at which they decide they can find compromise based on their desires, the fact that there's an enhanced military presence of NATO means that the NATO ought to be involved in this process. But then this means that peace will never be achieved effectively, right? We're going to have an unending Cold War type of situation, as Nolutando tells you. Why is this true? This is true because Russia and NATO, and de facto the United States of America, are fighting a global domination war. What that means is they'll always fight against each other. And we think that this becomes a problem because an enhanced military presence of NATO within the Eastern European countries effectively uses those places like as a ground for like a proxy warfare. We think that that is something that is not only harmful, but that laughs in the face of those governments at the point at which they want to make decisions on their own, independent of NATO and the United Nations. But before I proceed, I'll take a point from chosen opposition.
So what we have on
government is that their world is supposedly be better with Ukraine that has just been invaded and is clearly weaker, negotiating one-to-one with.
We think that at the point at which Ukraine wants to negotiate with Russia on its own terms, then that is fine, right? We think that the problem is when you want to involve NATO within that negotiation, because that negotiation ceases to be purely on the interests of what Ukraine thinks is best for itself, but also on what America and NATO thinks are best for their own exploits within the Middle East to check Russia in their global peace and contest. We think that that laughs in the face of Ukrainian sovereignty, and that's something that cannot be acceptable. Further on from opening government, we expand on why particularly this presence is bad for NATO, right? We think that NATO is an organization that is going through a rough patch, particularly with the presence of Donald Trump as the president of America. Recently, NATO has been having chats about funding and its defense spending. The United States has been threatening to pull out of the defense budget spending or cut it in NATO because it feels that it's the only country that is investing more into its defense than other countries. We think that this one itself shows a line or a sign of weakness within NATO. Why this makes an enhanced military presence in the eastern Ukraine bad even for NATO itself is that most of the countries within Eastern Europe, where NATO has military presence, aren't a part of NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as an armed house. They are doing this simply because there's some form of alliances, but also because it serves the interests of America to be there, or the interests of America particularly to be there. We think that is problematic because then it means that NATO has to go to lengths to spend money in enhancing a military presence there. And the point at which we spend more money to enhance military presence is going to demand lots more money from NATO members within their budget to finance that. At the point at which other countries with poorer GDPs can't afford to finance that, it becomes a problem because America constantly feels the pressure to finance that. And when America finances such of these things, it's exactly what happens that breaks up NATO, and we think that that's something that's bad. Proud to propose from government.
Thank you for your speech. And I would like to call Deputy Leader Opposition to close the upper half. Hear, hear.
Okay, guys, a few seconds to wrap up my sheets. Okay, cool. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this debate evaluates, first of all, the basis for which NATO was established. Secondly, the reason why NATO enhanced their presence in Eastern Europe. But thirdly, whether or not the enhanced presence of NATO in Eastern Europe fits into the primary goals of NATO, and whether the enhanced presence has served its purpose. The best response you get to this from opening government is to say that NATO has not been able to reclaim Crimea. But what they fail to realize is that NATO has been able to prevent a further expansion of Russia. And that's the thing. They cannot give you any assurance whatsoever on their side that once NATO stands down, that is not going to happen. Once that assurance doesn't exist, that's how come no matter the case they argue from government, they intrinsically lose today's debate. So Gulf is not to defend no presence within the region, because this motion is about enhanced presence, right? So unless they totally regret the existence of NATO, definitely they are not supposed to defend the no presence within the region. It means at least they defend a certain level of presence, right? But the reason with that is because that minimum level of presence was what existed within the region before the annexing of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine. What that means is that that level of security is not enough, for which reason the enhancement is justified to maintain stability within the region. But secondly, with instances like Ukraine actually applied to join NATO before Russian invasion. What this means is that in instances of interest and NATO protecting their possible allies, it's legitimate to enhance presence within that particular region to ensure stability. And so I'll be doing massive deconstruction for GAF, and I'll move on to my extensions. So various things that opening government sees. First thing, they say that there is no reason for them to exit. And that gives you many reasons. But secondly, they say we exacerbate tensions. That's false. Actually, what we do is to calm down tensions and ensure a stable region. Because after Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine, the region was unstable and tensions were high. But when NATO increased presence, that's when you had stability. That's a lie. You don't buy us. But secondly, they say we entrenchment, like there's entrenchment of Western hegemony. First of all, NATO has only enhanced their presence within the states and territories of their allies or members. So which means that these are states that buy into the ideas of NATO. But secondly, most of their heavy presence are with the most vulnerable states. And so when it comes to protection, this is justified. But thirdly, this hegemony is accepted by the people within which the hegemony covers. That's how come NATO, you are not coerced into it. It's willingly and by choice. And so you do not say that these guys are being bullied into hegemony. But third thing they say is that there is polarization of the region politically. First of all, this is not true because NATO presence neutralizes Russia's expansion, and the fact that NATO exists is an alliance where countries align their interests to form coalitions. That is a justified thing that exists within international relations. That's how come that is not bad. But secondly, polarity would always exist, even in the world, because once NATO stands down, there is nothing that proves that polarity would all of a sudden vanish and everything within the region would be okay. But third thing they say is harms. First thing they say, Chinese threat. We think NATO presence scares off a possible Chinese threat, just like we've been able to withhold and limit the expansion of Russia, and that's how come there is better utility on our side. But secondly, they say there is greater threat to countries. We think that's false. That's how come there is no massive proof on their side to show how that threat exists. All they can tell you is these guys are going to be exposed. That exposure is worse on their side, and that's how come we don't buy that. I'll take you in a bit. But lastly, they say US interest, and then they say the balance of power exists only on the face value. But no, that's false. Because what you have within NATO is countries like UK, countries like Germany, countries with huge influence to be able to check the interest of US, and that's how come NATO is not a puppet of US. I'll take your POI.
Hi guys, not every country in Eastern Europe loves the West because a lot of have remaining attitudes from Soviet Union. These countries on your side are pushed towards Russia when they see NATO bases and NATO military drills appearing more and more around them. Is that good?
So that's first of all not true. The existence of NATO military within countries and territories of their allies and their members doesn't scare off anybody. But secondly, you cannot just cook up this conspiracy theory and expect to win a debate with it because there is no proof to this, right? And that's how come you cannot just come around conspiracy theories. But they say that NATO hasn't been able to reclaim Crimea. I think I've engaged that by saying we've prevented further expansion. What they need to defend on their side is to show how their world actually looks like, because you've realized none of the Gulf teams have been able to defend that because they know that their world is actually very worse off and very messy because immediately NATO stand down, individual military forces are not enough, and that's how come you get more and more Russia expansion and Chinese expansion because they realize the weakness, especially when the struggle for power is one that is legitimate and all countries are doing it irrespective of what you do. But secondly, even if in the worst case scenario, US is using NATO as a tool to entrench their hegemony, we think members of NATO took a stance because in siding with NATO or in joining NATO, they realized and they took a stance with the global superpower they decided to support and form allyship with, and that's how come it's legitimate. But to CGPOI, they say why allyship and not membership. So these countries chose to be a part of NATO, and no one was forced, no one was coerced. So this whole issue about allyship, within countries that want to be allies can decide to be allies. Nobody forces people to join NATO. But ultimately, what you need to know is that even in the worst case scenario, where NATO members have no threat at all, and that's the worst case you can ever get from OP, it's principally justified, like Anam tells you, to protect yourself and prepare for all threats, because threats are unpredictable. And we think in this world, they allow tragedies and catastrophes to happen before NATO acts. We think that we reject such a premise. We think a proactive step in instances like this is one that is justified. What you get from opening opposition is a realistic evaluation of what happens when they lose and they stand down, they make NATO stand down. But secondly, they should be able to defend a Russian expansion and a possible Chinese expansion within a region that has very weak NATO presence. Other than that, they lose constructively on their side of the debate. We think today's debate has been very clear from opening opposition. We've never been proud to win on such stance.
Thank you for your speech. This concludes first half of the debates, and I will
You can hear me, right? Okay, cool.
Yep.
Opening half out of this debate on 3 grounds. First is that they never differentiated between a normal NATO presence in Eastern Europe, because these are NATO members, and an enhanced forward presence. The past, and finally, before explaining to you what the counterfactual looks like on their side of the house, what exactly happens when this is not the case. So I think the first thing to note is that Article 5 already exists, that NATO are always going to come to Eastern Europe's defense if Russia are going to invade, which takes out a huge portion of the OO case. Because NATO already has a defensive pact, they already guarantee Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, etc. The difference between a normal NATO presence and an enhanced NATO presence is that one is defensive and the other is aggressive. The other, which is putting tanks, rocket missiles, men right on Russia's borders. I think that is when this is not defensive, it is aggressive. Because I think, second of all, on characterizing Russia, because I think Russia in the past, if you look at its history, has been very scared and has a huge amount of paranoia towards invasion in the past. The fact that it's been attacked by Germany, the fact that it was attacked by France under Napoleon, the fact that, for example, it was threatened by NATO during the Cold War. Because look, if we know at the time, to take out the whole of opposition case, when we look at Russia's history, the times when they have been most aggressive, the times when they have been most expansive, was the point at which they felt threatened and scared. When they therefore had the desire to retaliate. That is why they invaded Finland after they felt a threat from Germany. That is why, for example, they invaded the Crimea, because they felt a threat when Ukraine was about to join NATO. So a huge portion of the opening opposition case falls out of this debate when we tell you that Russia is most aggressive in its response to threat. I think finally, what is the counterfactual? Because we tell you that on our side, we're far more likely to get things like dialogue and cooperation between Russia and the West. Why is this the case? Because there's a mutual interest involved. That Russia's economy has been tanking after for example, the sanctions were put on after Crimea. That on our side, they probably, if they're better able to trust the West, which we're going to show you that they will, they're better able, for example, to come to mutual bonds. But also, there's a far greater mutual threat to these countries. That is China. That China is on Russia's largest border. That has also been expanding. That the West also fears China's rise more than Russia. I think in the absence of the enhanced foreign presence, they're far more likely to cooperate against that common enemy. Therefore, four things. First of all, on rebuttal. Second of all, why you actually provoke Russia and get a cycle of escalation. Finally, why you strengthen Putin's position. Finally, why you worsen Eastern European countries, and why that results in more countries turning to Russia. So I think the main push from OO is about protection, right? But look, they never explain why Russia has an incentive in the absence of the enhanced foreign presence to actually be aggressive. That we tell you that there are always going to be for example, the Article 5. There are always going to be sanctions that tank their economy if they actually invade Eastern Europe. There's no reason to militarily invade Eastern Europe on either side of the house. Rather, I think what is more important in this debate is Russia trying to destabilize countries. Russia intervening, doing cyber attacks. Russia intervening in terms of political elections. I think that is far more likely on their side. Therefore, first of all, on a cycle of escalation, because we tell you that on their side of the house, when you necessarily put huge numbers of troops on Russia's borders, that is when it feels vulnerable. That is when it's going to take all measures necessary to guarantee its own security. Because let's tell you about Putin, right? Because no one has ever mentioned him in this debate, that he holds power on a nationalist platform, that he's able to gain support because he's an aggressive strongman that necessarily retaliates to all of its threats, which is why the people trust him and why they give him power. He cannot simply look weak and not respond to such a massive provocation when they're necessarily threatening to invade. I think he undermines his own image and the trust the Russian people have on him when he doesn't respond to this aggressively. No, because we tell you about American. The point at which you have American troops on Russian borders. I think the last time these things were happening was like during World War II, when you literally had German soldiers on Russian borders. Yeah, I'll accept PY from OO actually.
Okay, first of all, this debate is not about NATO invading the region, its presence. But your whole case is as if when there is police, thieves will come, so we shouldn't have police. That's the basic logic behind your case, which is highly illogical. That when you have police, thieves will come, so don't bring police. Like,
no, look, we were the only team to characterize Russia's incentives. We were the only thing that explained to you that what Russia's likely going to do in response to this. I think that is when we win this debate. Because look, we tell you that you confirm Russia's worst fears about an expansionist West at the point at which it put troops on the borders. Because how does Russia exactly respond? Because I think the first way it responds is that there's an incentive to create instability in countries like the West, to use things like cyber warfare, to intervene in elections as it literally did in the United States. Because look, to bring in populists like Trump. Because note, military deployments like the EFP, things like Russia wants to end, they require political stability, they require political will to keep these deployments for a long period of time. That is when Russia has an incentive to mess up the elections of countries, to interfere in democracies, to launch cyber attacks that harm everyone. But also, you necessarily create arms race when there's more, given the perception of a threat, Russia's likely going to expend far much more money on guns and arms in order to try and defend itself. Because again, this is not about Russia being aggressive on Eastern Europe. I think it's far more likely to look like Russia wanting to defend itself in terms of Western aggression. But look, on to my second point. Why you strengthen Putin's grip? Because why did people tolerate Putin's corruption and authoritarianism even after the fall of the Soviet Union? I think the reason why the Russian people tolerate a crashing economy, the reason why they tolerate corruption in Putin's regime, is because he was able to get utilize the fear and paranoia that people felt, that because of the reason that they felt fear and paranoia that the West was likely to invade, because of a huge amount of American troops ready to literally cross the borders in the Baltic states. I think that is when Putin is able to spin the narrative that the people should be scared, that they necessarily therefore have to turn to nationalist strongmen who are able to maintain order and spend vast amounts of money on the military. So I think that's when all of Putin's harms in terms of corruption and authoritarianism are worse. One, necessarily, the Russian people are likely to overlook these things because they believe he's the only one who's able to contain the West. The second of all, why you hurt Eastern European countries? Because there was never any democratic mandate or any kind of referendum within the country that allowed the West to come in. Because I think that we're going to actually explain to you the harms, the mechanism by which coercion exists. Because one, the point at which American troops are there, the point at which Russia is likely going to try and destabilize them more because they want to interfere in these European countries to make sure they reject the West. I think that is going to become reliant on Western support and reliant on Western arms, and therefore are going to necessarily have to buy into what the West does. But also, the point at which they have to compete for Western protection and more Western arms, I think that is when they necessarily have to try and become as pleasing to the West as possible. So I think that's when you have more pro-Russian groups in the region, pro-Russian terrorists in Ukraine that came up because they saw that the United States and the rest of NATO was interfering in Eastern Europe. So they turned to authoritarian dictators like Russia because that was the only person who was willing to fund their instability. But also, I think the point at which you have exploitation in the first place, that when these countries have to spend more on guns, spend more on arms because NATO tells them to, I think that is when these struggling economies are even worse off. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for your speech. And I would like to call member of opposition to open the case on that.
Hey guys, do you hear me well?
Yes. Does one of the debaters also please confirm?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. If for any reason my speech stops or gets lagged and cuts, you just type it in the chat so I can pause my time and start again when it's fixed, okay? Great. Just a second, please. Okay. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Firstly, some rebuttal directly to closing government. They say that countries are pushed towards Russia, like Middle Eastern countries. We say that that's false. Firstly, there's still a lot of resentment. These countries were threatened by USSR and are still threatened by Russia today, even before the NATO intervened. We say that these countries are not gonna say okay, let's go with Russia because I don't like NATO, because they don't really like Russia either. However, its approval and pro-Russian movements inside these countries don't appear of thin air. It's Russia meddling with those countries. We say that Russia has violated the protection pact that closing government says, even with enhanced NATO presence. Imagine what would have happened if NATO was on a normal presence that wasn't as hard as we have them on the status quo. We say that Russia's aggression is not military and disengages directly with closing government. They assume that all Russia does is like invade or defend itself with force. We state that Russia also utilizes its soft power to exert influence on the zone. How do they do them? First, how and why? Firstly, they still have the rivalry for US, so they want to control Europe. Secondly, they have the desire to reach USSR levels of power. And thirdly, they want to take the advantage from countries that have been characterized in all this debate as weak and like governments that don't have more than 30 years of existence. We say that if Russia meddles with US elections, the biggest country and most powerful on the planet, imagine the levels of meddling it can do with small countries with weaker governments. What do we have in closing opposition? Firstly, a framing that will instantly win against the closing half. We say that conflicts are not just between US and Russia. They have completely ignored violence inside these countries and between them. For example, from 1991 to 2001, there was a Yugoslavian war between Serbia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Slovakia. That means that violence is not just caused by tensions between US and Russia, it's also caused by internal problems. We say that, for example, the borders that were drawn after USSR and Yugoslavia failed, the racial and cultural tensions, Muslim, Orthodox, Protestant, Christians, ethnic differences, the constant fight of territories are factors that we have to take in mind. The key element in closing up is that we are not only going to prove that it is better to control Russia, but also to stop violence inside these countries like it did and like it has to keep doing. We say that NATO's compromise is to protect the people on principle on its basic foundation. Even if they don't really do that and it's so US interest, it still works because US interest means that it's going to intervene in any opportunity it has to exert dominance and to have influence in its own. That means even if they do it because of egoistic interests, they are still protecting the people, they are still avoiding conflict and protecting like the status quo. We say that there are two elements in this debate that have to be taken into account. Firstly, prevention, then solution. Why does conflict has stopped since the 90s? We say that it's because NATO has enhanced its intervention. For example, like the Serbian and Kosovo conflict was about to have a genocide committed by Milosevic, the Serbian president. The NATO presence and its like a force exerted by military intervention in these countries was what stopped this president from committing more violence and put an end to the war. The problem with Russia is that they don't really care about the people, they care about their influence, and if Milosevic was pro-Russian like he was, they were not going to do anything and people were vulnerable. We say that the 29 countries that spend more than any part of the world on military are part of the NATO. They impose respect and de-incentivize conflict. We say that if they are more pressed, Russia, firstly, is not like going to, even if it arms itself and it gets very defensive, that's better than the world where it utilizes its soft power to meddle with elections, to put pro-Russian puppets on government like it has. Like, for example, Ukraine almost like had a conflict, internal conflict because Russia wanted to put a pro-Russian governor on the like highest stake. Firstly, point from opening government. Opening? You there?
And please note how the opposition bench conveniently ignores argumentation of how an increased presence in the military in the Eastern Europe increases the NATO budget, and this is exactly what is threatening the very existence of NATO. At this rate, we won't even have the semblance of protection that they are crying about.
We say that firstly, the Donald Trump situation is very contextual. Like what's going to happen in the probably next election is that Trump is going to lose after what's happening now in the US. That means NATO gets its funding back. Secondly, we say that these countries are still afraid of what Russia can do in Eastern Europe and their power. So they're not going to like sit tight and watch how Russia creates chaos. That aside, we say that these countries with internal conflict have to also control themselves because they know that if they attack or do something violent towards the people, towards our country, NATO will intervene, even if Russia. This is the reason why the conflict since the 90s has decreased, and this is why Russia has tried to put puppet governments in Eastern Europe, but has failed because the NATO intervention and the NATO presence in these countries has proven as an effective balancing mechanism for these countries. We say that even if it's all about U.S. interest, the fact that it's going to side with a weaker country in order to control Russia, it's better because the country gets a better deal. We say that what happens on all the government bench is that Ukraine, a weak government that has just been invaded, is going to try to negotiate one-on-one with Russia. That means that the solution, and I'm going to go to my second point, is not going to be fair at all. Even if in opening even in closing opposition, we have also U.S. interest on the table when they negotiate. It's better than they are vulnerable to asymmetry that is so big between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Kosovo, Russia, Serbia, Russia, Slovenia, etc. We say that the solution, even if it's towards U.S. interests, it also benefits these countries and it proves as a beneficial impact. We say that what would have happened in government's case, because still we don't get a clear counterfactual, is that NATO with weaker presence, firstly, it has limited access to the negotiation table. Secondly, it has limited military power and limited disincentivizing power in these countries. That means that the risk that the conflicts inside these countries continue or that Russia tries to intervene is bigger, it's worse for the country, it's worse for... Thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech. And I would like to call government to close the government bench. Hear, hear.
The reason we win in CG is that we're the only team that gave you actual analysis as opposed to giving a historical example and extrapolating from there. We're going to show you what the actual counterfactual is. We're going to show you what the incentives of Russia are. And in that counterfactual, given that they still have economic power, because now we're trading with them, they're probably not going to do all the nefarious things that CEO talked about, because putting a puppet leader isn't necessary when you're having economic trading anyway. Firstly, what is this counterfactual? Because this seemed to elude the entirety of the opening half. Judge, look, there's a distinct difference between increased presence in Eastern Europe versus the previous NATO thing. Because crucially, this specific is an aggressive act. What does that mean? That means NATO will still do things like interventions of war that CEO wants to talk about, because those are things that NATO does anyway without this specific thing. But the difference is now that NATO shores up and puts more tanks, more missiles near the countries that are near the Russian border. That was a critical distinction that no other team actually seemed to recognize. But the second thing to note, panel, is that we told you that before the whole Crimean crisis, where NATO tried to vie for Ukrainian membership of NATO, right? We think Russia was at the discourse table. They were willing to get economic cooperation because it suits them. Notice, panel, they're an export economy. They export oil and so on, so forth. They necessarily need international trade. Fundamentally, on their side of the house, with this aggression, they have to necessarily rely on putting up puppet leaders, because that's the only way you get a leader to trade with you. On our side, when the economic cooperation does exist, you have no cost benefit needed, panel, in order to do these things, right? Because CEO stand up and they say, imagine all the meddling they'll do afterwards. This meddling is only existing right now, guys, because that's the only way for them to actually defend themselves and their economic interests. We think it costs a lot of money to actually sabotage a lot of countries. Like, on our side, they don't have to do that. Okay, first question. First question then. How do you why does Russia sow discourse and instability around the countries? We fundamentally told you, panel, that Russia has a rich history. Unfortunately, it's a history in which it has been consistently invaded, whether it's World War I, World War II, even the Cold War, where it was demonized by the entirety of the West. Fundamentally, panel, Russia has post-traumatic stress disorder that isn't really helped when countries along its literal border have missiles and troops that can literally attack its capital city if they wanted to. Notice this distinct imminent threat is the reason we get a Russia which is incredibly threatened to do things. Because fundamentally, we think that in our counterfactual, in their side of the house, panel, with this act of aggression by NATO, it is a world in which Russia engages with other things. Because notice, Russia can't compete militarily because it has limited funds, because it has limited military technology, military innovation. What does this look like? Three things we mentioned in CD. Number one, intervening in elections. Things like Brexit panel, Cambridge Analytica, USA. Russia literally has hands in facilitating the rise of populism within Europe and in Europe. It has hands in facilitating the rise of populism in the UK and even in the USA panel. Fundamentally, notice because they're able to do this because if the NATO or the Western country is unstable, they're less likely to attack them or be more aggressive. But secondly, notice the rise in hate groups that is facilitated by Russia, because fundamentally, Russia and Russian cyber attackers have attacked the opposition of certain hate groups during election. This looks like during the French elections, Marine Le Pen being backed by Russian attackers. This looks like the AfD and Pegida in Germany panel being fundamentally directed by and benefited by the actions of Russian hackers. Look, panel, Russia will take action. On their side, they sow dissidence, discourse, lead to the rise of populism that harms the most vulnerable people of a society. They create a world in which hate thrives. That is unjustifiable. Secondly, on which side of the house do we fundamentally have a better Eastern Europe? Because we tell you, panel, you stifle democracy within these countries. How so? We tell you that fundamentally, USA is the dominant group in NATO, right? We tell you that when USA threatened to pull out of NATO, every other country was investing a lot more money, right? This is important because what it means, panel, is that Eastern European countries, if they want to work and get the protection of the USA, they have to go for predatory trade deals. Because when the USA comes to you, panel, and say, take this economic deal, even though it's not beneficial for you, you have no choice because the alternative is an aggressive Russia that has been provoked by the West in the first place. But notice, panel, it's even worse when this pact makes Eastern European countries put more money into the military, right? Because although stand up and they say the military is good for COVID-19 because they help the thing, right? I think these countries would be even better, panel, in dealing with COVID-19 if Hungary didn't spend $270 million on a weapons trade with USA and use that money instead for its healthcare system. Notice when you are in this NATO, because of the increased aggression by NATO, there is increased demand for you to spend money. Fundamentally means these countries are worse off because they have to spend more money in military, they have to spend more things, and all this matters because these are budding democracies, right? But even more importantly, we told you incentivize Russia to interfere with countries in the first place. And that's so important because look, when Ukraine is potentially joining NATO due to this act that wouldn't exist in our counterfactual, that is the world in which Russia invades Crimea. Notice, panel, this effect was caused by this act and increased NATO aggression. This leads to, panel, all the things that CEO talked about, because all their harms is a defensive measure. Because fundamentally, Russia has to sponsor more state terrorism in these countries. They have to sponsor more pro-Russian groups. All of these harms fundamentally exist because that is the only way Russia prevents these Eastern European countries from joining this act or become more defensive, right? This wouldn't exist on our side. Even more importantly, I think the crucial thing we give you is that you strengthened Putin's role. Because look, Russia is a country that is not the best right now. It's not livable. The people are giving a lot of their rights. Fundamentally, they're buying into the narrative that Putin gives, that the West is coming after us. On their side, that narrative exists because there are missiles near their borders. On our side, it becomes less potent, and in the long-term panel, we're able to not have one of the worst aggressive people in power. Side opposition never understood that Russia is a country with a distinct history. It is a country that feels threatened, and when it is threatened, it engages things like sabotage, destroying discourse, destroying democracy. If you care all of these things, I think you do. You vote closing government.
Thank you for your. And I would like to call opposition whip to close this debate.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to move to a better connection zone. Give me one, please.
Okay, hi, hello, do you hear me right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna start now. Give me a second, please. Okay, in 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, wait a second. POIs in the chat, please. I don't want anybody to interrupt me, please. I'm sorry. So, okay, 3, 2, 1, go. We gave the whole Camera of Government, especially the lower government camera, the opportunity to actually engage in the actual characterization of this debate, that it's about the internal conflicts that happen in these Eastern European countries. Sadly, they didn't actually took it and just limited themselves to the counterfactuals that are just fake or already refuted. So let's go first to the only 2 counterfactuals that government presented, and we're gonna refute it. First, they said that there's like a small possibility that there will be like an alliance between these Eastern European countries, and we already explained that why that won't happen. Because historically, we're talking about countries that are product of the division of Yugoslavia. We're talking about that post the Soviet Union fall, Yugoslavia, there was like this huge zone divided in like almost 6 countries that has like a lot of inside problems. They have, as we already explained, cultural problems. They have religious problems. There are like Muslim minorities. There's like Russian Orthodoxies. There's like Christian people there, and there's a lot of conflict inside. But not only that, when Yugoslavia was divided, there was like this huge problem with borders that it doesn't really matter if they were like just, if they were fair. The people still believe that the division of the borders inside these countries is really unfair, which lead to the whole war that happened, that is called the Yugoslavian War, that it was like this huge thing where a lot of people started to die, okay? We believe that therefore, because this conflict still remains to the day of today, this alliance is really not likely to. But in the second place, they present us the second counterfactual, that they say that they can negotiate peace with Russia. We ask how a small country as, I don't know, Croatia or Serbia, that is able to negotiate with one of the most militarized countries in the world. We believe that this counterfactual and the other one, as we explained, are totally unreal and will not happen in this world. We have explained, therefore, why these counterfactuals are useless. But we're going to explain why do we win this debate. We believe that in upper cameras, it was like this debate of which imperialism is better, like, right? American imperialism is better or Russian imperialism is better? We should use the NATO, like opposition said. We should use the NATO in order to stop Russian expansionism. And government said no, because NATO is bad. We believe that even like this doesn't really matter in this debate, okay? We believe that we can argumentate, we can present a lot of reasons to believe that one imperialism or one expansionism is worse than the other, but we believe that until a certain point, this is kind of a wash in this debate. We believe that, okay, expansionism is bad in most cases, and this is on a scale. Therefore, we have to determine, or we have in which scenario is this conflict better handled. In which scenario this internal conflict in these imposed Yugoslavian countries is less harmful to the people. We believe that therefore, I'm still not going to take points, we believe that therefore Russia is not the best choice. We're going to give exclusive reasons why they can't. As we have already explained, Russia is actually part of the conflict. As we don't know, as we know, Russia was like the main zone, the main country of the Soviet Union, and still hold conflicts, still hold like internal anger, and still hold like resentment from these countries to Russia. Actually, there's like a whole discourse that of these countries that do not like Russia, and they have like really deep conflicts of Russia, and even fear of possible military conflicts. Okay, and not only that, like as my extensionist already explained, as Golos already explained, Russia still have interest inside the Eastern European small countries that have already shown when, for example, a Russian tries to impose these puppet governments and these puppet leaders in places like Croatia. We believe that therefore we have to choose between, we have to determine evidently that Russia is not the best country, is not the best possible way to manage these internal conflicts that happen, where Serbian nationalism commits genocide and there's possible military conflict all the time between these countries. We believe that why NATO is better, like even in the best case of government, where NATO is like this evil institution, but that just just wants to impose American interests, that actually they haven't mechanized and they haven't explained why NATO is like this. But let's not worry about that. Let's even concede that. Let's even say that okay, NATO is this evil institution that is basically America and Donald Trump. We believe that even in that case, we have to be extremely comparative, okay? We believe that historically and until now, if NATO wasn't in this place, if NATO wasn't in these Eastern European countries, possibly the inside violence wouldn't have stopped, and actually it would have gotten even better, even worse, with Russia, because of the reasons we have already explained. We believe that even if NATO is this evil institution, the only possible way to solve the problems inside these countries is with this institution and not Russia and not China, that matter only in this debate, like Russian expansionism or China expansionism matter only in this debate to be comparative, and when we're explaining why they can be harmful, but only when we're talking about in this point of the debate. Okay, point to the OG, POI to the OG. POI, OG.
So, the United States, even via NATO, is involved in a global domination proxy war with Russia. Enhancing its presence means that the region has a significant say in how peace would to be built in Eastern Europe. This effectively locks the entire region as proxy war regions and furthers and eliminates the entire possibility of having peace within the region.
But they haven't explained these reasons in their debate. They haven't given us reasons why they wouldn't have these military conflicts inside these governments of the Eastern European countries. We don't really believe that it's the time to start argumentating that. We believe that the thing that matters the most in this debate is to stop the inside violence that happen in countries. Okay, therefore, what have we done in this debate only exclusively in the lower camera of opposition? First, we have explained the real characterizations that reviewed almost all of the counterfactuals and reasons given by the government. Second, we have explained that sadly our upper camera arguments were kind of expendable. They weren't really explosive or the most important in this debate. And finally, we've given reasons why the NATO have been comparatively the best way to handle this conflict. Therefore, we have won this debate. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. I would like to thank everyone for this debate. I'm guessing there's going to be a question about the results. Can one of CA?
Guarata?
Hi, sorry, could you just say that again for me?
Talking, sorry, I can't. One of the CAs. I'm guessing debaters are going to have a question when the results are going to be out. Who made it to the final? Have any information on that?
Yes, so you guys can leave now. The judges will be allowed to deliberate. We're just going to wait for the ESL semi-final at 11 to conclude. So that means the final announcement will be, the announcement of the teams progressing to the final will be released, but it will be around 1 or 1:30 CAT time.
Okay, thank you very much for the information. And again, everyone have a nice evening or day, whichever time zone you're in, and judges go to the deliberation room.
So that was the open semi-final room 1. Thank you to all the teams. We appreciate you guys. Once again, this has been this house regrets NATO's enhanced presence in Eastern Europe. Thank you, and we will be announcing the teams that progress to the semi-final in a few hours' time. Hope to see you guys then.